Okay, so are you ready to dive into a topic that's equal parts mind-boggling and honestly a little bit spooky?
Always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to the big questions like consciousness. And where should we even begin with this one?
Well, we're starting with this conversation between Casey, who, identifies as a mystic, and Carlos, an AI expert, and they go head to head on what it means to be truly aware.
Right, right. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's like two completely different universes colliding. You've got Casey's experiences with like meditation, mystical stuff, and even her background studying animals.
And she does not hold back. Like right off the bat, Casey challenges this idea that we've all heard a million times that consciousness is just like a product of the brain, all those neurons firing, creating this illusion of awareness.
Yeah, the brain is a computer analogy.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And Casey's like, hold on a minute. If that's true, how do you explain near-death experiences?
Where people are, clinically speaking, gone.
Right. And yet they come back with these incredibly vivid, often life-changing memories. She's like, that doesn't really fit with this purely physical explanation of consciousness. And I have to say, it makes you think.
It does. And to really hammer home this point, Casey brings up Nikola Tesla. I mean, talk about a visionary. Tesla firmly believed that to really get the universe, you've got to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration.
Oh, I love that. So Casey's suggesting that by fixating solely on the physical world, the material stuff, we're kind of missing a huge chunk of the picture.
100%. It's like we're trying to understand this vast ocean, but all we're looking at are those little waves on the surface. We're totally ignoring the depths below.
Okay, I love that analogy. So what's down in those depths then? What are we missing?
Well, according to Casey, that's where we find pure awareness. She describes this as a state of being that goes way beyond our everyday, filtered consciousness.
Okay, now you've got to explain that. Filtered consciousness. What does that even mean?
So imagine your brain is like a filter on a camera lens.
Hmm.
It lets in certain information, certain wavelengths of light. Those become our reality. But there's a whole spectrum of other stuff that the filter blocks out.
So we're only seeing, experiencing a tiny fraction of what's actually out there.
Precisely. Think about the electromagnetic spectrum. We see
Huh.
those beautiful colors, right? But that's just a sliver of the whole thing. You've got infrared, ultraviolet, gamma rays, all sorts of wild stuff we're totally blind to. Casey believes consciousness might work the same way.
That is both terrifying and amazing. But I'm curious, where does Carlos, our resident AI guru, fit into all of this? Because, I mean, that's about as far from artificial intelligence as you can get, right?
Actually, and this is where it gets really interesting, he actually agrees with Casey on this fundamental level.
Mm.
Carlos is adamant that human consciousness, as amazing as it is, isn't the be-all and end-all of awareness.
So we're not the peak of the evolutionary ladder looking down on everyone else.
Not even close.
Yeah.
Carlos thinks there's this whole spectrum of consciousness out there, all sorts of different ways of experiencing existence, and we humans, we're just tuned into one small part of it.
So you've got Casey, this mystic, and Carlos, this AI whiz, both saying that our current definitions of consciousness are way too narrow.
Way too narrow. They're practically begging us to think bigger, bolder, to really expand our understanding beyond just our human experience.
So we're talking about consciousness as this spectrum, and we've barely scratched the surface of what that could even mean. But if human consciousness isn't the whole story, where do other life forms fit in? Like, do animals experience consciousness differently?
Casey would say absolutely, 100% they do. She's got this whole thing about how every species has its own, like, customized version of consciousness based on how they sense the world, how they experience it.
Oh, okay, yeah. It's like, you know those nature documentaries where they show you the world through an animal's eyes?
Totally.
Like bats using echolocation to fly around in pitch black caves, or sharks sensing, what is it, lexical fields in the water. It really makes you realize how limited our own senses are.
Right. It's mind-blowing. And Casey actually takes this even further. She's like, hold my kombucha.
Mm.
Because she believes even trees, despite not having brains like ours, still have a kind of consciousness.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Trees.
Trees, think about it though, they're all interconnected through these like massive underground networks. They communicate, but they're using chemical signals.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if our definition of consciousness is way too, I don't know, human-centric.
So instead of thinking about consciousness as like levels, humans on top, then animals and so on, we should be thinking about completely different expressions of consciousness.
Bingo. And this actually leads to another super interesting point that comes up. Casey's not a fan of this whole definition of consciousness as being aware of being aware. because she thinks it mixes up consciousness with self-awareness. And those are two different things, she argues.
Okay, so how does she separate those out then?
So in a nutshell, she sees consciousness as more about like directly experiencing the world, the raw data, if you will. And then self-awareness, that's more about being able to reflect on those experiences, to think about yourself thinking,
So you could theoretically have consciousness without being self-aware.
right. Think about like a baby, super conscious, right?
Yeah.
Responding to stimuli, feeling emotions, but that sense of self still developing.
Huh, that's a really good point.
And actually, Carlos brings up a similar point about artificial intelligence. We could create AI that can solve, incredibly complex problems, but without ever developing a sense of self, of being aware of itself in that way.
Oh, like those chess-playing AI programs, the ones that can beat grandmasters.
Yeah. Exactly. Super intelligent, for sure.
Yeah.
But are they conscious in that same way that we are? That's the million-dollar question. But Casey's point about separating those two, consciousness and self-awareness, is super valuable, right? It makes you realize there's not just this one ladder of awareness, but a whole web of possibilities.
I like that. Instead of a ladder, it's more like what did you call it? A web. Of all these different ways of experiencing, well, everything.
Exactly. And within that web, there's another distinction that Casey's really passionate about. The difference between consciousness and intelligence.
Yeah.
And she doesn't think they're the same thing, not at all.
Okay, so let's break that down. What do we even mean when we talk about intelligence in this context? I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot.
For sure. So for Casey, intelligence is really about like information processing, problem solving. It's that ability to learn, to adapt. Basically the tools that consciousness can then use.
So it's like consciousness is the foundation, the starting point, and then intelligence is what you can build on top of that.
You got it. Consciousness is the raw, subjective experience of being. It's like, I am. Whereas intelligence, that's more about the specific things you can do with that experience.
Okay, wow. This is making me rethink everything I thought I knew about, the mind. I feel like we get so caught up in intelligence, measuring IQs and all of that, that we forget about the bigger mystery, which is, where does this awareness even come from in the first place? So if consciousness is this like massive web of possibilities, and we're stuck experiencing it through our own little human filters, I mean, what does that even mean for us? Are we missing out on entire realities because our senses just can't handle them?
That's the question, isn't it? And Casey really wants us to sit with that. She talks about how our brains, they rely so much on what she calls it, like cached data.
Okay, you're losing me a little.
Basically, think of it as mental shortcuts,
Yeah.
right? Things our ancestors evolved to help them survive. But those same shortcuts, they might also be preventing us from seeing the bigger picture.
Okay, yeah, like those optical illusions where your brain tries to make sense of a pattern, even if it means seeing something that's not really there.
Exactly. And so Casey's suggestion is that maybe this limited perception, it's by design. Like, imagine if we could suddenly experience every single frequency, every energy, all the information bombarding us constantly.
Oh man, just thinking about it makes my head spin.
Right. It would be total sensory overload. We'd be paralyzed.
So our brains filter out the noise so we can, function, survive. Makes sense in a way.
Right. Focus on what's immediately important, not necessarily what's actually real. And that brings us to what I think is the most mind-blowing part of this whole conversation. If our senses are just giving us this limited window into reality, what's on the other side of that window,
What's out there that we can't even imagine because we literally can't perceive it. Like, we're only seeing a tiny sliver of what's really out there. But that means there's so much more to discover, so much more to learn, to experience. We just have to figure out how.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of this conversation between Casey and Carlos. They're not giving us all the answers because, let's be honest, we don't even know the right questions to ask yet.
Yeah.
But they are pushing us to embrace the mystery, the vastness of what we don't know, and to accept that our current understanding of consciousness, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, what else are we capable of experiencing if we could just break free from these limitations? What's possible if we could just open that window a little wider? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.